Good afternoon. Just. My name is Patrick Lucy. I'm an aquatic ecologist, and I have been working with the City of Colwood since 1985 on sort of matters related to water. And this afternoon we have a couple of invited guests working with us on a much larger regional program. But first I'd like to just introduce and say welcome to Mayor Desjardins and Councillor Hundleby from Esquimalt, a little bit further to the east and lower in elevation than we are here. Pim Jager is an engineer from the Netherlands who is flown in to spend 3 or 4 days with us on a tour of programs that we've been developing in Vancouver and in the CRD. And then our guest speaker is Professor Nick Ashbolt from the University of Alberta. And I'm going to get both of our colleagues to just speak very briefly on their backgrounds, what their interest is in collaborating with us here in Colwood, and then I think we'll launch right into the presentation. And of course, my colleague Troy Barraclough is here after that as well. So, no. I will not start again. Sorry. So apparently we're being webcast, and I don't even know what that means, so it's beyond my pay grade. I'm just a gumboot biologist. So, Pim, can I just get you to maybe come up and speak into the microphone? Just give us a quick background on why you came from the Netherlands.
That is absolutely true. Yeah. So, hi, I'm Pim de Jager. I'm an engineer. I work for the Wageningen University, small town in the Netherlands, as well as DESSAR, which is a company in the Netherlands. And at the Wageningen University, we developed a concept called new sanitation. Basically, we look at the wastewater as a resource rather than a waste. This concept is being commercialized by a company called DESSAR, and we have about 10, 15 projects realized in the Netherlands now, a few abroad elsewhere in Europe. We collect black water separately from the grey water on a neighborhood scale, convert it into biogas, which we can power actually the entire system with. So basically, the system is energy neutral, and we have a small surplus you can use in households. It's just biogas, and we extract all the nutrients to produce fertilizer. Furthermore, we use a vacuum system to collect the black water, so we save about 30% of our water use. Now, our water use is a little different than here. Here you use about 450 liters per person per day, I learned today, and in the Netherlands it's about 120. But I visited a few times here in Canada, also together with the professor that initiated this concept. We noticed there's lots of interest here actually for this system, so we decided to follow up on some of these leads. And last visit actually also brought me in contact with Patrick, and hence now I'm here.
And just on that note, one of the items that we've been discussing over the last couple of months is the Dutch group are looking for places to put in demonstration projects. And of course, one of the things that we're looking at in Colwood is a special demonstration management zone. So the entire municipality becomes a place to promote and procure innovation on all wide range of new technologies that lead us into the 21st century. And of course, we're delighted to have people come from other countries and bring their technology here. And of course, we've just had, now what's your name again, Councillor? Oh, Judith Collington has just arrived. So, Nick?
So thank you, Patrick, for the introduction. So I am from the University of Alberta. I don't have a very strong Canadian accent yet because I've only been here for about 8 months. Prior to that, I actually was invited to the US Environmental Protection Agency, where I worked for nearly 7 years as their senior research microbiologist. And the reason why I was brought in was, before that, I was a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and for the previous sort of 18 to 20 years, I've been working on alternative strategies for looking at ways of managing urban water systems from a public health perspective. So I work very much, I'm a microbiologist, agricultural scientist by training in the University of Tasmania in Australia, where I grew up. And I've worked in all sorts of areas since then, up in the tropics, in the Rum Jungle, a mine site in the northern part of Australia, in the Northern Territory, just southwest of Darwin, for example, where the first Australian large uranium mines were. And there were lots of overburden, acid mine drainage problems from there, so I've worked on those sorts of issues. I've worked down in the Antarctic on hypersaline lakes of the Vestfold Hills of Antarctica, which is pretty much due south of Cape Town. And then for about 20 years I've been in Sydney, worked with the Sydney Water Corporation as their senior research microbiologist during the, I'll call it the heyday of doing all the environmental assessments before the commissioning of deep water ocean outfalls. So developed up a whole team to look at the environmental and microbiological impacts from that. And prior to the the tendering and commissioning of Sydney's filtration plants, because up until 1996, Sydney, the city of Sydney, of about 4.5 million people, had unfiltered water. They now have it filtered, and so we did most of the primary work on the requirements for that filtration to remove pathogens like Cryptosporidium and so forth. So all of that background and working with the Swedish government over a 10-year period on urban water sustainability metrics, which is what I want to really focus on today, saying, well, if we're going to look at alternative systems, well, first of all, why do we need alternative systems? And secondly, if we're going to look at alternatives, what are the metrics and aspects that we really need to look at? And one of the take-home messages here is really from a systems-based approach. If we just focus in on public health, or we just focused on energy, or we just focused on ecosystem services, we may not end up with the right complete system. And so having the system view is one of the messages I want to get across in this presentation this afternoon. So I should launch into that. So that's the title, it's the rationale for resource recovery. So you've already heard from Pim, and no doubt from Patrick and others over the years, that if we frame our thinking around, we're dealing with resource management. We're not dealing with waste management. And when we think of sewage, it's a resource. Of course, our drinking water we think of as a resource, and this is just part of the water cycle. So how do we think about this whole system as a resource that really changes the nature of how we conceptualize, if you like, the problem, and how we look at opportunities? And all of this really started back thanks to, I think, really the Brits, in the modern day sense of sanitation and drinking water. John Snow has talked about here in this slide. So in the 1830s, when the Brits were going down to India, the subcontinent, and bringing back cholera, they brought it back in charge in about 1831 that led to a successive number of major outbreaks. As you can see there on the slide, 23,000 killed, 53,000, large numbers like this through major epidemics in London and in England in general, and of course through most of Western Europe at that time also. And it was John Snow's claim to fame here is really as the father of epidemiology, because there he is as an anaesthetologist back then, anaesthetist, understood airborne issues and realized that the dogma back then, which if we go back to the 1820s when they were closing the Houses of Parliament on the Thames River because of the stench, they thought that the disease was coming from the so-called miasma theory, coming from the air. And Snow thought this was rubbish and went about to investigate these outbreaks, and one in particular, as you can see here on the slide, in 1854. He basically identified in the Broad Street pump in Soho in London that the common factor of people coming down with cholera was that they collected their water from this pump. And so the second part of the title there, after epidemiology, there's a little bit of an acronym that stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. Now that's a term we use today in food production for assuring the safety of food. Snow was really the first inventor of this concept, although he didn't refer to it as that, because his idea was, well, let's take the handle off the pump so people will not get water from this contaminated well, which is drawing really water from the Thames River. Now, there happens to be a Reverend Whitehead who investigated this a little further, who is not written up so well in the history books. And I'll just spend half a minute more on this slide, sorry for dragging it out, but these are key motivations that have really installed our institutional frames and governance in how we manage water ever since. So the first is that Snow identified that waterborne disease was carried by water. It wasn't for many years later that Robert Koch actually identified the bacterium responsible for cholera. And Whitehead actually identified that it wasn't the Thames water per se that was the problem in this particular case. It was that someone who had had diarrhea and died of cholera, in fact, the bedpan from that was thrown out onto the street, and that fecal matter contaminated the wellhead, which drew up the water that people were then using as their drinking source water. And so it was actually Whitehead who identified the real source of the problem was the wellhead was not well maintained. And taking the handle off the pump was superfluous because the time the handle was taken off, the epidemiologic curve, as you go back through the history, you can see this, had already reached its peak. And it was because that cholera bacteria got flushed out of the system by then, and so cleaner water was coming through there. Now, of course, there was contaminated water in the Thames River. It wasn't as though it was pristine by any means. But this is just to highlight that our focus thereafter and the inquiries that followed that led to, in essence, sewering of London, which Joseph Bazalgette was a great engineer, and that was thanks to the steam engine that really the Brits learnt how to move sewage uphill, and so they could take it from low-lying areas out, and ultimately, what does the word sewage mean? Seaward in Old English. So it's to take it to the sea. And that's really what the sewer systems were developed. So the sewer systems were developed in ignorance of the bacterial cause of the diarrhea. They thought it was miasma. They were getting rid of the bad smells. Snow identified that the waterborne route is the source of the problem. And Whitehead really put his finger on the pulse saying, we need to manage sewage if we're going to really manage these sorts of diseases. Okay, enough spent on that slide, sorry. Let's now jump to the modern era, where I used to work at the US Environmental Protection Agency. They've recently published this work, which is, is US-centric. I seem to say no data from Canada almost up there on this graphic, but we'll forgive them for that. The point really is that with our heavily urbanized society now, in general, across the world, and here in North America, to a fair degree also, we're losing the battle of, as you can see here, of our rivers and streams are losing ecosystem functioning. Why? Because in part of agriculture and the other major part are nutrients coming from sewage releases into waterways. Some of the parameters that are used to look at this, of course, there are biological, chemical, physical, as you can see here, and health types of issues that are looked at. And across most of these sites, they're in poor condition, and many of them are in poor condition because of fecally borne indicators, which means potentially pathogenic organisms in the water bodies. So despite 40 years now of the Clean Water Act from the US Environmental Protection Agency that everyone thought was fantastic, and it was in its early days in the early 70s through the 80s, we're now losing the battle because there are just so many people and discharging partly treated or when it rains raw sewage into our waterways. Another problem, if we look at our current sewage systems, which we in essence inherited from the Romans, which the Brits modified with a few steam engines. We look here at the energy used. This is just a general graphic. On the left there, the amount of kilowatt hours, and look at how we might save energy from an energy point of view. Water conservation is the first and the cheapest thing you can do. So you can reduce the demand at the home by having dual flush toilets, low flow shower heads, minimizing green lawns and having more xeriscapes if you live more in a desert environment, which I gather this is pretty a low-level rainfall environment even here. You can go a little bit further after then moving into stormwater reuse. So you capture that, and so where I've been looking at just recently in the city of Calgary, for example, the city of Calgary has a major stormwater collection program now and reuse for parks and gardens. And that, again, is using much less energy than having to treat potable water and then put that onto gardens. That makes sense. But when we go the next step, we start moving into having to look at renewable energy. But our current infrastructure, we sort of hit a brick wall that we start going up again when we start moving into microfiltration, ultrafiltration, and ultimately reverse osmosis to treat our water. And if we look what's happening in southern US at the moment, there are 3 communities now that have gone for direct potable reuse, which means sewage is fully treated conventionally, and then through reverse osmosis, advanced oxidation, disinfection, and put straight back into the drinking water main. And this is, as I said, it's now happening with 3 communities. It has been happening since 1969 in Windhoek in Namibia, which was the first place and country in the world to do this. But really, the US now is pioneering this because of water scarcity. But even that doesn't make sense to me, and hopefully to you by the end of this presentation, because we're going to be using much more energy to treat by reverse osmosis than perhaps is necessary. And where I do come from in Australia, we've spent a lot of time looking at recycled water that is non-potable. And in fact, it's now mandated at most new developments in Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide and Perth that there are 2 mains. We call this a dual distribution system. So there's potable water in one pipe going to homes, and there's reclaimed wastewater treated really very well. So if you accidentally ingest it, you're unlikely to get sick. And indeed, there have been cross connections, but no one has got sick from it. And that second pipe is connected to your toilet, to your clothes washing machine if you wish, and to your garden outdoor irrigation needs. But if we look at rainwater as the other alternative that's used a lot in Australia, we can see rather horrifying numbers here. So on the right-hand side is what's the average amount of kilowatt hours that are used to move 1,000 litres of drinking water on the right. And if we look at desalination, which we think of as bottled energy, that's one of the most expensive from an energy point of view. You can see what the maximum there is in green, and the average there is just a bit under, it's really about 3.8. We can see that rainwater systems, depending on how they're constructed and used, can be anything as nearly as high or higher, perhaps, than desalination. And this in Melbourne is the case simply because often there are 2-story buildings there. There are sumps, if you like, collecting the rainwater in the basements of the buildings, so there's a high head to pump that water. If you look at everyone's individual pump, and if they don't have a slow start pump but a rapid turn-on pump, they use a lot of energy. And so you can actually end up using more energy than a desalination plant, if you think about this at a community scale. So you need to be careful how we think about engineering alternative systems. That's the energy side of the story. Now let's look at the nutrient side of the story. We know eutrophication means that we end up with too much, particularly in freshwaters, phosphorus, and in more coastal communities, too much nitrogen that leads to excessive algal growth, leads to then those algae being degraded and loss of dissolved oxygen in the water body, so you can end up with fish kills and, in essence, jellyfish zones and dead seas, like we see in the Gulf of Mexico, like we've seen previously in the Baltic Sea. Is due to simply too much sewage going into those environments, or nutrients. The other side is that whilst we're discharging seaward, all those nutrients through agriculture and sewage discharges, global agriculture relies on phosphorus. And you can see here, this chart just shows you how much we've used from manures historically, and now from human excreta, only a small wedge. You can't really see it, it's just a thin black line in this graphic. And rock phosphate now is used hugely now. So this is fossil guano. It's taken literally many, many millions of years to be developed. And we're mining that. And the expectations are within 70 years to maybe, if we're lucky, 120 years, the economically accessible rock phosphate will have been fully mined. How are we going to survive as a species with all the extra people coming on board if we don't have phosphorus, which is an essential mineral for our food production? And this just shows you, it's a little bit hard to see in this lighting, but just the take-home message in red there you can see is that 77% of this known rock phosphate occurs in Morocco. You can see there are deposits in Florida, parts of China, down in South Africa, and Morocco is not known for its political stability. So a little bit like the current Middle East issue with now we have a dilemma, except for the oil sands, we have a dilemma really of petroleum sources, if you like, in the Middle East, and the instability caused there because of political upset. Think what's going to happen over rock phosphate. So we need to really be thinking this, as I said, this systems-based view. So we're now thinking about the water resource itself. We're thinking now about the energy, thinking about the pathogens, where they're coming from, and the nutrients. All of these things need to be thought of if we're looking at what makes sense as a more sustainable solution for our communities. So coming back then on the right-hand side, you can see a graphic, and this is, again, US-centric, but I think it's pretty much the situation here also. We look at where water is used in the home. So, roughly about 22% is used to wash our clothes. About 15% is needed as actual potable water that we might clean our teeth with and ingest. Shower water, you might want to say that needs to be potable water quality also, although it could be rainwater. And toilet flush water certainly does not necessarily have to be potable water, and that's over 25% typically. And then we lose, on average, at least 13%, and in different districts that can go up to easily 30% of the water before it even reaches the customers, just leaking through the distribution systems. So a term we coined a lot in Australia, and it seems to have caught on, and no doubt it was probably used elsewhere before, is water fit for purpose, meaning we don't necessarily have to have potable water for all our domestic water uses. It's just that we've built a system around that. In fact, we built it because the fire insurance industry said if you have a waterworks in your township supplying water to fight fires, we will give you, and this happened in actually after the Great Fire in 1666 in London, but it took a couple of more centuries before it hit North America. And in 1870s, the insurance industry started up in North America, and they gave you a 30 or 40% reduction in your premium if you had a waterworks supplying water to your house areas for firefighting. And because of that, we've had excessive water supply. In fact, today we still design our waterworks distribution system to maintain fire flow and pressure for firefighting in communities. It costs us a huge amount to supply that sort of infrastructure. Okay? But we don't really need to have all that as potable water. So the thinking here is water fit for purpose, and I'll come back to the performance-based targets later on. And all of this is wrapped up around the concept that these are all resources. So it's how do we have more integrated and thoughtful resource management of these components. And I'll focus quite a bit next now on the health side, because back to John Snow, it's what really drove the reform in supplying clean water to the poor, as was the rule that was brought in London, and that led to water treatment systems throughout Europe and then North America coming into play. And it's probably the greatest human intervention in saving lives has been the treatment and disinfection of drinking water. So this systems thinking, this has jumped around a little bit, sorry for the overlap. The diagram on the right is a diagram we came up with in the Swedish Urban Water Program, and it's really trying to sort of conceptualize that we have users ourselves. We've got organizations like EPAs and health departments and other regulatory sorts of institutions. And then we have technology. And so all of these have an interplay. The technology needs to be usable, and it needs to be somehow regulated. And I'm not so sure that the organizations have a direct input to users, but it certainly goes back the other way. There are political pressures on our regulatory bodies from users. So we think about that interface there, and what's hidden under the words there is that there are at least three often. When we talk about the triple bottom line to do sustainability reporting, we're thinking of economics, we're thinking of environment, and we're thinking of society. So they're the three. And in this project, we just split out the human side a little bit more to the health-specific issues about chemicals and microbials that can be through water exposure pathways. And we split off economics separately there, and social, cultural things. And the last one we split off on the far right there is technological functioning. So that means a couple of things. It means that we can actually manage the system, and most importantly, and the least studied in some ways, is the robustness, reliability, and if we like to wrap that up in resiliency of our system. So if we think about today's current sewer and water supply systems, when we have a major storm, we lose electricity, we may lose ability to supply drinking water, and we certainly may lose that power for pump stations, and we get backflow of sewers into people's basements, all sorts of havoc occurs. Our current sewers leak. About 30% of the water never gets to the sewage works. If you are connected to a sewage works, it leaks out through the sewer system into the environment, causing background pollution. And a very interesting study of a colleague of mine in Wisconsin has shown that leaking sewer water has ended up into source drinking water into wells in Wisconsin, for example, leading to disease from viral infections. So our current system is actually not very resilient, even though we've had a good 150 years of refining our current centralized approach for supplying water services, I'll call them, but drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater services. So looking at this whole system view, we need to look at these parameters and understand the relationship and the interactions of the whole package. Because if we look at the bottom line there, you can see that there's been, initial focus was on removing organic carbon. We talked about that as biochemical oxygen demand. So how do we get rid of the organics? So that was when we developed activated sludge and trickling filters to remove the organics. So when that sewage wastewater ended up in the river, it would not deplete the water of oxygen and kill the fish. So that was our first realization. Then we realized that nutrients were a problem and pathogens were a problem. And so we keep adding on belts and braces or further treatment steps to our conventional centralized thinking. And every time we do that, there's an infrastructure cost, a financial cost, and a displacement of funds that could have gone somewhere else in society have been sucked up into this, if you like, this dinosaur that is never-ending animal that has to be kept fed because of this huge sunken infrastructural cost. So standing back from all that and say, well, if we had a clean piece of paper, what would we design our systems around to meet a more sustainable future? So it's those metrics now I want to go through. So thinking from a systems point of view, I know this is a very messy diagram, but thinking a lot about this over the last nearly 20 years, there's only about half a dozen key metrics, I believe, are useful as a bottom line to compare one alternative to another. And this can be any system. It can be a fully centralized, a fully decentralized, various hybrids, whatever. And these are, we need to have an assessment of the human health from chemical and microbial hazards. And we can measure all of those with one metric. It's used in the clinical area. It's been used for since the mid-80s. It's called the Disability Adjusted Life Year. And in fact, Health Canada uses this in the drinking water guidance across the whole of Canada. The Disability Adjusted Life Year is the common metric used for managing drinking water health now. And I'll come to it a bit later on, but I worked a lot with the World Health Organization and using that metric, and it's used also in Australia. So I'll come back to that. From an environmental impact point of view and some chemical risks to humans and society, we can use what's called life cycle assessment. Where's that lost off on this? We've got life cycle costing in there. Sorry. We can go to that. That's from our economics point of view. We've got restoring natural hydrology. So the more we can restore back to the sort of pre-development days of our local ecosystem, generally the better we manage the whole water cycle. And then energy and contaminant release, those two are really wrapped up in what I started to say earlier, which is life cycle assessment. So this is and I'll show you in a minute, a standardized procedure. And the last one that I referred to before is this measure of robustness, which people have really not thought so heavily about. And I have currently a postdoc developing up some ideas with me on that. And I'll talk only a little bit about that later. So these are the metrics on the left-hand side there, and we can think about that today and well into the future, whether we're talking about 10 years' time, 50 years, or 100 years. Because if we think about pipes in the ground, they last or should last up to 100 years before replacement. And even then we might be able to in situ re-drill and replace or reform them. And so we need to be thinking about these sorts of timescales. Then the last dimension on this graphic is really trying to say, well, what's the context of the boundaries? It can be just a small community or even a single household up through to a broader community, like here on the whole southern part of the island, for example, through to a Canadian or provincial level, whole of BC, for example, and then we can scale it right up to the global level. So we can use these metrics across these various scales. Okay. So hopefully now we've got some sense that there are core metrics that can be used to look at alternative systems. So I just want to remind ourselves, what is the current sort of paradigm? It's shown up here. So we either harvest water from surface waters, from rivers and lakes, or from groundwater system. Goes through some conventional treatment, which is typically some filtration, but not always, but it does have to, in this part of the world, in North America, at least have a disinfectant, typically chlorine, added to the water, kill off those pathogens. Then that's supplied through the one pipe to households, and in the household, of course, we have what we call black water from our toilet flush water that goes with our grey water from our showers, our sinks, and everything else, our washing machines, combines to produce what we call sewage in the household. It goes off to our wastewater treatment works, where we then separate out the solids. That ends up as what we call biosolids. Some of that can be beneficially reused, but most is not, sadly. And then the effluent is typically then just discharged. And of course, if we're talking in an ocean environment, often there's only a very crude screening of large particulates before then that residual primary sewage is released into the ocean environment. Some people live on septic systems, and so they try to do these sort of in situ treatments at the household level. But we think of all of this as waste management. And I would love you to walk out of this room saying, no, we won't call this waste anymore. These are resources. Yes, we do have issues. We've got pathogens, we've got potentially excessive nutrients, but as you just heard, phosphorus is going to be limiting global food production. Maybe not here on this island, but it is globally. So why not set some examples here to help the rest of the world learn how to develop systems to recover phosphorus as well? And nitrogen, of course, is the other big nutrient problem, which does cause eutrophication issues in coastal communities here. Pharma refers to the various pharmaceutically active compounds. We often hear about the gender-bending drugs that end up in drinking water that might be turning men into women or vice versa. Of course, this is ludicrous. It does not happen with the human species, but it does happen with ecosystem members. So there are various fish and other amphibians, a range of biota, in fact, that in the presence of different drugs do change sex. They call that imposex. So they can change sex. So I guess some of the classic ones have been the alligators down in the Keys area in Florida, for example. So when we do our risk assessments, in fact, the level of these sorts of compounds back into drinking water is so small. We've got ourselves caught here because the technology for detecting low numbers has got better and better. We've gone down this rabbit burrow of going to have lower and lower detection limits means, well, we need to go lower and lower, doesn't it? Well, no, from a human health point of view, actually that's a misnomer or a misunderstanding. Yes, it is important for some ecosystem members. So we need to be thinking here about then if we're looking at water reuse, where is that pharma products best discharged? At the moment, we discharge it into ecosystems where it does impact, and we don't return it back into toilet flushing water or garden irrigation areas where it would have much less impact. So again, we need to think about pharma and various biocides as well. So what is a term now being used is the one water idea, which is to sort of think about, well, it's not that we just have wastewater and that's dealt with by some wastewater department, and over here we have the drinking water jurisdiction and those people never talk to these people. Unfortunately, that's what we have today, and where I used to work at EPA, we would have whole buildings, one building for one and one building for another, more or less, as the regulatory side of that. And they do not really talk to one another because they're set up by law to deal with these things separately. So this is a fundamental governance issue that we need to overcome. But thinking of just the physical water infrastructure, if we go back and say, well, at least 70% of that water in the sewer is grey water, which could easily be treated and reused possibly more locally, either in the household or locally within a community. We don't need to pump it and carry it by gravity to a sewage works to treat it. And then, as in Australia, we then turn that by more energy with pumps back into the community. So we're double pumping that water as well as treating it, all for the purpose of just to flush your toilets. So grey water using more locally makes more sense. And where all the energy to recover, and as you can see here, and maybe in the next graphic, I've forgotten where I put it now, the amount of energy that is inherently in the organics, that's in the food and fecal residuals that we flush down the toilet, that we spend more energy to treat, to remove that nitrogen, to turn it back into nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, which takes energy, and we then pump it out to sea or whatever to dispose of that phosphorus. That's all using a lot of energy, and it uses roughly about, in North America, nearly 5 to 7% of electricity production is used to pump and treat water in urban societies. That same amount of embedded energy is actually in the food and fecal residuals that we're spending all that energy to dispose of. So there's the waste mentality, using all that energy, rather than thinking, here's a resource that we could recover. In fact, if you look at plants in parts of Europe where Pim comes from and other parts of Europe, they're actually net zero now, at least at the wastewater side, that they recover as much energy as they put in to deal with that sewage management. Well, if we go to something like what Pim's suggesting, and I'll give you some examples later on in a more theoretical context, we can actually be positive in our energy recovery. Okay. And clearly, as I've mentioned before, demographic from urbanization and climate affects our current infrastructure hasn't been good. But these sorts of loops where we're recovering energy, we're recovering both energy as electrons back into the grid as well as heat energy, as we're at Falls Creek here, just across the water, is a nice pioneering example of. This makes us think, hey, there are fundamentally different ways when we frame it around resource recovery to deal with our urban water systems. So I want to now spend time on where one of my passions lies, which is in the actual pathogens, the agents that cause disease. Because all of this, as I said, started with John Snow and then Robert Koch actually identifying the Vibrio cholerae bacteria that causes the disease cholera, and later Salmonella that causes typhoid. And they're, for those who aren't so familiar with the microbiology, they're both bacteria. And so really because of that, and early microbiologists around 1906 developed methodologies that were really to identify the presence of these sorts of bacteria from fecally contaminated waters. We call these coliform bacteria. So we've had an engineering tradition now about removing coliform bacteria, meaning then, oh, the water is safe, isn't it? Well, no, it's not. And the reason is, it's a bit hard to see. On the right-hand side there, we've got parasitic protozoa, and many of you probably have heard of Cryptosporidium or Giardia causing the diseases, cryptosporidiosis and giardiasis. Really quite common in North America, particularly giardiasis. It occurs at around about 5% of the population, causes a lot of stomach rumbles and lots of flatulence and is a bit uncomfortable and goes through these cycles, can be treated by drugs, whereas cryptosporidiosis is actually not treatable until very recently, at least, by drugs. So, but we do, our naturally immunity gets rid of it. So this used to be killing AIDS patients in the early days of AIDS because of their vulnerability. Now they're on better medications and changes, and so they're not dying of cryptosporidiosis these days. In fact, they're not dying at all these days because of drug therapies. So they're the parasitic protozoa, and why I mention those is that Cryptosporidium is totally resistant to chlorine disinfection. So you can actually soak Cryptosporidium in household bleach, 37% hypochlorite, and it's still infectious. Okay? And this is why it hit us in a few places where that they removed the bacteria but didn't remove all the Cryptosporidium, and there have been some classic outbreaks. And the biggest one is the one in Milwaukee that was back in April 1993, where some 400,000 people, the city of Milwaukee came down were thought to have come down with this disease, and many hundred or many thousands were hospitalized during that outbreak. So that's why we can treat water, and that water was meeting coliform requirements. Okay? So they've got these chlorine-resistant protozoa, we've got the bacteria that you've heard about, and then we have enteric viruses. These are ones like norovirus and adenovirus, and we all have heard more about poliovirus, which is also a waterborne virus, which is no longer a concern because of our vaccination programs. And the last, so they're all what we call enteric or waterborne pathogens. So they come from the delightful terminology, the fecal-oral route of exposure. Sewage into the water, and through the water passage back to our mouth, giving us the waterborne disease pathway. But we've now realized, and I'll spend a little bit more on these other, what we call water-based pathogens. And we've probably heard of or read about Legionnaire's disease, identified in the late 70s, and really, and why? Because a group of Legionnaires were at a meeting in Philadelphia, and they came down with this. And why did they come down with it? Because it was growing in the air conditioning system of the hotel where they were having their convention, and they were breathing in the aerosols containing these Legionella bacteria, and this is a lung infection. And why it's a lung infection is a little bit unclear, but on that diagram or graphic, you can see the green bacteria. They're actually inside an amoeba, and that's the natural reservoir for these Legionella bacteria in the environment. So they grow naturally in water aquatic environments. But they grow particularly well in engineered environments, which means hot water and cooling tower type systems. So our engineered water structures are a natural home to amplify more of these Legionella bacteria within the amoeba hosts that are feeding on the biofilms within those environments, the slimes that grow on the surfaces. And we're now realizing that they're a major cause of disease. So let me just go through some Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data. So these are more the enteric diseases where all the emphasis has been in the past because of snow, going back to those early days. And when we look at outbreaks that occur in the US, actually a lot of the time we don't have the agent identified. And this is because, if you think about it, if you get a case of diarrhea, are you going to see a medico? Well, a large proportion won't unless you're really sick. When you go and see a doctor, what's the doctor going to do? Probably prescribe you an antibiotic and send you home, unfortunately, and I'll come back to why that's a further problem. And if you're lucky, so to speak, he'll ask for or she'll ask for a stool sample, and most of you aren't that keen to give them a stool sample, so that fails. But those who do end up giving a stool sample, when it gets to the lab, the medicos just sign the form saying, I'll just do back dose screening on this stool sample, thank you, and forgetting about the viruses and the parasitic protozoa. And so we don't get these agents identified quite often. But when we do, you can see here, there's the Milwaukee story with the Cryptosporidium. Hominis is the species that causes human infection. In fact, there's been a long story here of a lot of my work with the EPA and before that with the Sydney Water Corporation was that Cryptosporidium is a disease of all neonatal mammals. So we get it, muskrats get it, everything else gets it as well. But it's quite specific. So we don't think there are many species from animals to humans except for young cattle that are scarring and with diarrhea can release a human infectious Cryptosporidium. Parvum is the species. But most other, from adult cattle, from many other animals, including birds, the Cryptosporidium is thought not to be human infectious unless you're heavily immunocompromised. So there's a story there about managing Cryptosporidium. Unfortunately, the US EPA, where I used to work, just says we'll treat all Cryptosporidium the same. And so they're over-treating or over-regulating, in that sense, causing community a lot more money expenditure where it's unnecessary. So here's an issue of getting the balance a little better. And you can see some of the other pathogens. But what I really want to focus is on the top here. Legionella, so only since 2001 has the CDC been collecting data on this class of pathogen. And to their horror, when they started to do that, it accounted for about 28% of all the outbreaks. And it accounted for 80% of all the health costs because this has a high rate of killing you compared to the case of diarrhea where you've got about a 0.05% likelihood of death. And if we look more closely, so the CDC then did a follow-up study, which was published only in 2012 by a woman called Sarah Collier. And this was a very interesting study. So she went to all the insurance claims for Medicare and Medicaid, the two insurance systems, which we know about the US insurance system. So it's not giving everybody, but just looking at the cases of hospitalization that could be attributable to water or drinking water-related pathogens. This table is a real eye-opener because our cryptosporidiosis and giardiasis, and for that matter some of our noroviruses that we think are coming through water, are significant. And in fact, all of these add up to about $1 billion, that's with a B, $1 billion per annum of hospitalization insurance claims in the US. So it's a big number. But the vast majority, like 90%, is due to Legionella and another group of similar environmental bacteria that grow post-treatment called non-tuberculous mycobacteria. So these cause lung disease, and those of you who put your feet or fingers into pedicure treatments and sit around and enjoy a cup of coffee while your fingers are being done, or toes, this is one of the most common infections that women get in those sorts of places, is from these non-tuberculous mycobacteria, just to put you off your fingernails. Okay, so that brings us to, in some ways, that we've got now these lung infections and skin infections through exposure to pathogens that grow potentially in drinking water systems. And so I want to talk a bit about why they grow there and how they grow there. But before, I want to just, this was from The Economist back in 2012, so this is a pretty mainstream, somewhat, I guess I wouldn't use the word right wing, but it's fairly much that way, sort of magazine. I enjoy reading because it gives you another perspective on life. And they had a cover, as you can see here, of they say the microbes maketh man. I guess they should have said humans, but that's just a reflection on the Economist's editorial staff. But the human there is actually made up of microbes. To depict that, if you could read the small text on the right-hand side there, it says words to the effect that, in fact, each of us in this room, 90% of the cells are actually microbial, not human cells. We're just scaffolds, and most of those, of course, were within the gastrointestinal tract, but there's a fair amount on our external epidermis cells as well. So thinking about, okay, that most of us are really microbial, we're now realizing that those microbes aren't just hanging around having a good time, feeding on us and giving us interesting smells. They actually are vital for our well-being, totally. And so we need to be thinking about that. So that brings me to antibiotics, which do end up either because we urinate them the next day after we've taken a dose, or we dispose of them, even worse, down the toilet system, which has been made illegal in many parts of the world, but I'm not sure is illegal in this country. Why is that a problem? It's a huge problem. Let me explain. So on the right hand, that's a graphic that was in the New York Times just earlier this year. And it's depicting not only a fat pork pig there, the chicken house, and what's inside the farmhouse there should be cattle, but a very fat-looking farmer also. And they didn't say this in the story, but in the 1950s, Pfizer, who were promoting, of course, antibiotic use, saw a huge windfall. We can sell vastly more antibiotics if we put them into animal production. And why would we put them into animal production is because it upsets the microbiome in a way that actually decreases certain members of the gut microbiome that leads to extra fat tissue being stored in your liver due to the microbial products of the remaining microbiome, that leads to fat deposits, which means if you had that within your first 3 to 5 years of age of any antimicrobials, you are being primed, along with your genetic and your diet subsequently, to being obese. And they used to have a competition for swine farmers in the 50s to promote antibiotics by saying which farmers can get the fattest quickest by actually giving the farmers the same antimicrobials. And this is what helped sell them like hotcakes, because the farmers could see how fat they got. They wanted their swine to get even fatter. And so they brought on board and started this practice. Now, in Scandinavian countries and a fair bit of Western Europe now, this is now banned in animal production, largely, although there's always this sort of back door that for therapeutic purposes you can still use antimicrobials. So there's a certain amount of misuse of that. But the big point here is that we've known, really, since the 50s, that this can lead to obesity. Taken a colleague of mine in New York, a guy, Martin Blasser, who published this book again earlier this year. It's a really interesting read. It's a very readable book in the sense of a lay terminology. It's a whole series of woe of, whilst antibiotics have been a fantastic savior of many, many lives, of course, we're now realizing, on balance, we're a lot worse off because of the misuse and now the antibiotic resistance that's out there. So they've been hugely overprescribed because medicos are given an incentive by a big pharma to just pass out these drugs. They have a performance-based payment system to medicos to sell you more drugs. And we have the farmers who have been primed to overuse these drugs in animal production. And where does all that end up? It ends up in the sewage and the waterways. And it's not the antibiotics that I'm so worried about in the environment, although they are problematic. Wherever there are antibiotics, there are antibiotic-resistant genes. And what we're now realizing, those genes get transferred. It's part of the natural way that bacteria deal with genetic information is they share it around because these genes can be handy at certain times. And bacteria have a plethora of mechanisms to share genes around. We call it horizontal gene transfer. And what we're seeing now is that horizontal gene transfer from wastewater goes to our wastewater treatment bacteria that go out into our environment, into our sediments, and go into our sediment native bacteria. It then ends up, if that's a freshwater sediment, into our source drinking water that ends up in our pipe biofilms that form naturally with normally so-called healthy bacteria in our distribution systems. And I'm hypothesizing, because there's no clear evidence of health burden yet, but this gene exchange, if it was to get into these environmental pathogens that I talked about, like Legionella and non-tuberculous mycobacteria, where we do already see antibiotic resistance, if we were to get some more important antibiotic-resistant genes into those species, when we go to treat our Legionnaire's disease patients and our non-tuberculous mycobacterial respiratory and skin infections, our antimicrobials may become ineffective. And we're already seeing that ineffectiveness with some of the TB multiple resistant strains and some of the enterococcal resistant strains in hospital environments and Staph aureus. So we know it's a reality today that we're getting to the point that these antibiotics will be no longer functional. So we need to pull back, and so part of the water cycle is also involved in the cycle of those antibiotic-resistant genes back to us in society. So that's another key area that you won't see any regulation on around the world yet. And I'm part of a team working with the World Health Organization saying, well, how might we better manage this environmental exposure pathway, whereas there are already others working in the food production area, in animal production, to minimize the use where possible of antimicrobials. So all of that brings me to water reuse, and this table here is a lot of data, but what it's really emphasizing is something that I said earlier. Remember, I used the word coliforms have been used since about 1906 as our regulatory organism to say, yes, the water has been treated, and yes, really, from the point of view of bacteria, because it's not a good measure of parasitic protozoa or viral removal. But we've used that, and we call it Title, in California, one of the first was called Title 22, which came out in the early 70s, or actually mid-70s. 78, I think it was finally published. And then there's been a modification in about 2007 as we've learnt a bit more about some of the viruses and that we need to also remove those guys. So in Title 22, they specify two things: a total coliform requirement at the end of the treatment train, and also a certain proportion of removal for human enteric viruses. But again, that virus work was actually based on the historic work done for poliovirus found in wastewater, surprisingly, back in the 80s. We now have molecular methods and other new methods to identify human viruses. We now realize there are not just 10, 100, but 1,000-fold more infectious virus particles in sewage than when they based these initial studies. And yet they still have not modified Title 22. In Arizona, they picked up on that a little bit thanks to the work of Chuck Gerber at the University of Arizona to bring in a slightly different requirement, which we more or less copied in Australia with the work we were doing with the dual distribution systems I mentioned before, that we were treating that water sufficiently so if you were to accidentally ingest it, it would still not make you sick. And my team did the original risk assessment work for that reuse work in Australia. But all of that is really at the end of the pipe. Let me show you this graphic. And I know it's a big table and it looks a bit confusing, but the take-home message is that if we look at wanting to supply, in this case, a safe drinking water to a community of about 100,000 cubic meters per day sort of production, how many samples would we need to take of that drinking water to be sure 95% of the time that we would actually not be increasing the risk to that community? The answer we can work out mathematically, and this is what a PhD student of mine did working actually at Kiwa Water Research, or KWR as it's now called, Patrick Smeets, who along with others was part of an EU project that I was involved with over about a 4-year or 5-year period. And one of the messages we developed here was, well, if you want to have a 4-log reduction, which by the way is what the Safe Drinking Water Act requires for virus removal, you would need to take, for this community, something like a sample every 15 minutes to check for viruses, and something like 30,000 samples a year. No one on the planet does that. So nowhere do we have a monitoring program in place today for sampling for pathogens that is adequate to protect human health to the level we think we need to protect to. So this led a number of us back actually in when was it? It was about 1998. We sat around, about half a dozen of us sat around a table in Stockholm at the Karolinska Institute, led by two people, Jamie Bartram from the World Health Organization and Laura Futrell, who was acting as a consultant to the WHO. We came up with a program which my colleague has now recently published 2 books on. So I've jumped to his books. On the right-hand side, this book was just launched only last month. It's all about tales of woe, where things go wrong in the supply of drinking water to communities around the world. So this is from Steve and Elizabeth Rudy, as you can see maybe on the right-hand side of this book cover. And it's really a whole lot of stories of why things go wrong, like the Walkerton situation, that no doubt many of you are very, very familiar with. That was a breakdown in several things, but predominantly the Koch brothers operating the waterworks really didn't have a clue how to manage their system, really didn't have a clue of the hydrologic link between the surface fields and manure management going into ponds and pumping out of wells. And despite the water level dropping down every time they turned the pump on, they didn't realize that pond was connected to the well. And furthermore, they fabricated their chlorine residuals because they couldn't be bothered to fix and put back in place their chlorine dosing device for that community, which again is illegal, of course, and why they went to prison. Or one of the brothers went to prison. So these are classic stories, but if we think about it, if we use what we call now a water safety plan approach, and that is where are the hazards, where are they coming from, where are they best managed, that's what we call now a water safety plan, which, going back to my second slide, is really the hazard analysis critical control point process for the water industry. So in Australia, we helped pioneer that, worked with the World Health Organization. It's now used, it's mandated in Australia to use this process. I was unsuccessful in getting it mandated by EPA, one of my losses there, but at least we used some of the principles within the EPA current construct. Luckily, and one of the reasons why I've come to Alberta and I'm funded by the Alberta government for the next 7 years to work with the municipal area, and as you may have seen in my title, it's a translational chair in health for water. The translation bit is all about getting water safety plans into the regulatory scene in Alberta. And in fact, Alberta is the first province or the first jurisdiction in the whole of North America to put in place drinking water safety plans. And I'm working with others in Alberta Health to get that same thinking for recreational waters and for reuse waters, which is similar to what we have in Australia. So that's a management plan around identifying hazards and where best to manage them as a whole system. So it could mean, or does mean, watershed protection to help minimize the contamination in the first place, as well as dealing with riparian zones and all sorts of things that Patrick's company deals with, through then the treatment plant and what are the performance measures we should have on board there, and all the way through to customers' taps, which means looking at Legionella growth and management in the distribution systems and in the premise plumbing. Again, nowhere in the world except recently in Germany and in the Netherlands, in the distribution system, do they actually have a requirement to monitor for Legionella, despite it being the biggest cause of health burden through drinking water systems now in developed regions of the world. Okay. How are we going for time? Running out? So this is all wrapped up in this water safety plan approach. So I want to just say a little bit more about the risk assessment part. I don't know how I'm going for time. For some people, you time sensitive? Probably? Okay. There is, so it's very important. My apologies for taking it a bit slowly. So I know you're not really wanting to dig into the weeds, but just to say a little bit more about the quantitative microbial risk assessment process that identifies what is the risk from the various classes of pathogens. I'm a leader in the world, along with others in North America and some of my colleagues at RIVM in the Netherlands, and Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, where we've been pioneering these methods and putting them into helping us better manage water systems. And so the process is identifying, well, what are the key pathogens that we need to be worried about, and to select members that are representative of those groups. We call those reference pathogens. And the other really important highlighted bit up there on the top right is, what are the events? So if you go back to Steve Rudy's book, it's all about events. Most of the time, our water systems manage risks pretty well. But there are times they get overloaded or things are missed. And these are what we call the hazardous events. So these are things that can happen in the normal scheme of life, but are not hopefully too regular. And so the real message is we need to identify those hazardous events and think about where and how we manage them. That is the most important step. So rather than putting another UV filter on to manage overall risks at a waterworks, for example, which is a current discussion in the city of Calgary that I'm working with them on, it actually probably makes no sense to spend $60 million to put on for Cryptosporidium management, because it's probably largely coming from adult cattle and is non-human infectious. Whereas it probably makes much more sense to look at stormwater management, because that may be carrying sewage-borne pathogens which are human infectious into Glenmore Dam. potentially, and impacting on the source water. So these are the sorts of things that we need to think through. What are the hazardous events and what are the key reference pathogens? Then we run through, and this is the case for reclaimed water, what is the distribution of each of these reference pathogens, how much is removed by each of the treatment barriers, how much may grow back in the plumbing and in the shower heads, ultimately to when we get exposed. So looking at the whole system. And we've got actual data from human exposure measurements that have been done epidemiologically, so we know for how many Cryptosporidium it takes to get you to get diarrhea and all these sorts of other outcomes, which is nice to think about. But yes, these used to be done with prisoners in the 50s, and now more recently the equivalent is grad students at universities. These are done through ethically approved programs. And all that gives us the integrated data of, well, from this distribution of pathogens and source and all the vagaries of log reductions or how many % reduction we get through the treatment drains to the points of exposure, we can then estimate the likelihood of getting ill. And that brings us back to that earlier graphic saying, well, what's our health target? And the health target in Canada is this 1 disability-adjusted life year per million head of population. And that's an agreed to by Health Canada target. So we use that as our reference point. And these are just some other reference points just to highlight that in the WHO, as I said before, and the EPA have used this. So the 3 and 4 log reduction is just a 10-fold reduction. So a 3 log reduction means a 99.9% reduction, which sounds like a really lot. But when you've got millions of organisms and you're just removing 3 orders of magnitude, you're still left with another 1,000. Okay? So you do need to think about these in what we call a log 10 sort of count, rather than absolute numbers. So although it's not EPA policy, as you can see here, that 1 infection per 10,000 was used to set the enhanced surface water treatment rule for the virus and Cryptosporidium removal requirements by the US EPA, which have been really copied here in Canada. I worked a lot, as I've said before, on drinking water, and in Australia we have a reuse standard now of 10 to the minus 6 disability-adjusted life years. And I worked a lot with the recreational water criteria that came out in 2012. That was one of my main jobs at EPA, where we looked at epidemiologic data. And this is interesting because of all the water quality standards around the world, the coliform standards, for example, they're not based on any epidemiologic evidence of health outcome that if you've got more than 1 E. coli in your water, you're going to suddenly get more sick. There is no evidence to support that whatsoever. Of course, if there's more E. coli in your water, there's a higher likelihood of fecal contamination, but it makes a huge amount of difference whether that's coming from sewage, where there's a real human health risk, or a muskrat, where there's some possibly, but probably very little, versus Canada geese and some other avian species where there's an even lower level of risk. So all E. coli are not equal. That's why we do these risk assessments, to try to tease out the real issues between the different sources of pathogens and the pathogens themselves. And we use this risk assessment framework to help drive our water safety plan management. So we have a systems assessment part, we have a operationals part where we set the operational parameters based on this quantitative microbial risk assessment approach. And we have management and communication based on this as well. As you can see here, we published the first lot of this report back in 2006 with my European colleagues, and it's ongoing. And the work I'm doing currently in Alberta is further developing this for the province of Alberta. And so to wrap up, the last part here is to come back to Legionella. This is really a hidden, it's the, I guess the US terminology here is the gorilla in the room. No one's talking about it. But it's the biggest health burden, along with the non-tuberculous mycobacteria, and there is currently no US regulation except a clause in the Safe Drinking Water Act that says there is a maximum contaminant goal, which means it's not a regulatory requirement, but it's an aspiration to have no Legionella in drinking water. But along with that, there's no regulatory requirement. In fact, there's no regulatory method specified to measure those Legionella. So no one does. Okay? Well, not no one is not quite right, because my group back at EPA was, and before me there are others at EPA have been saying, hey, Office of Water, this is an issue we should be dealing with. And they keep saying, oh, it's a problem in cooling towers and in hot water cylinders. It's not really a drinking water issue. It's how people mismanage water once the utility has delivered that water to site? Well, if you are in the game of environmental health, you should be in the game of what happens in buildings as well. But a paper that I'm just getting published at the moment has actually looked at across the whole of the US. We've looked at the north and the south and the east and the west communities, and we've gone out into distribution systems, and we've taken sediment samples from drinking water reservoirs. This is where we manage our pressure and this firefighting supply, and largely why we have these reservoirs. The sediments in those, we've found it's a high occurrence of Legionella, most of which is not thought to be human infectious based on the genotyping we've been doing, but around about 30% of them actually contain Legionella pneumophila and serogroup 1, the causative agent of Legionnaire's disease. So at low levels, these sediments are seeding the distribution system, and our chlorine in general will kill or turn those cells into organisms which are no longer culturable. So the Dutch and the German method specifies to look by culture, so they would not see it, but the Dutch, of course, don't have chlorine residual in their water. By law, they're not allowed to. So they see the Legionella and they see the E. coli because they're not disinfecting that residual water going in the pipe systems. But here in North America, where by law we have to have a disinfectant residual, we don't see these organisms even though they're there and still human infectious. So we have a real problem. So we've put together this little conceptual model, and just to work through how we use this in our risk assessment and say, well, what concentration of Legionella might be important in drinking waters in premise plumbing is what we're trying to answer. So we work backwards. Well, we know we need something like 1 to 1,000 cells in our alveoli to initiate the infection. So how many have to be in the air when you're taking a shower to breathe in to get 1 to 1,000 in your lungs? It's actually about 2,500. Depending on whether you're a mouth or nose breather, it ranges by a couple of orders of magnitude. So it's somewhere in that sort of range, around 3,500 per colony-forming units is what the measure of culturable cells is in a cubic meter of air. So you can get that potentially with a 5-minute shower or whatever. So how many do you need in the water to be aerosolized into these less than 7 micron size aerosols that we actually breathe deep into our lungs? Well, that is an even higher number, and it's around about 70 million. The Dutch requirement in drinking water, and the German for that matter, is to have less than 1,000 per litre. And if you think about, well, actually they need to be about less than 1,000 out there in the distribution system, because if they come into a building and you sit with a stagnant pipe, it might be warm if it's above, particularly if it's above 25 degrees centigrade and stagnant and no residual. That's the conditions that leads to potential Legionella and non-tuberculous mycobacteria proliferating in your plumbing system, and you get a slug of this coming out in your shower head. And if you're vulnerable, you can come down with Legionnaire's disease. And if you're less vulnerable, you come down with just a mild fever we call Pontiac fever. And most people just I feel a bit off today, may not go to work. And so if you add up the health burden due to that, which no one has actually done yet, there's a huge cost to society from these sorts of respiratory pathogens. So we've identified now when the critical concentration is, it's around 70 million. And more detail, which you probably never wanted to hear, but I'll give it to you anyway. These are organisms that grow naturally in these amoeba, because that's what they do. They've learnt to stop the amoeba, who normally come along and feed on bacteria and digest those bacteria. These Legionella and the Legionella, bacteria, and the amoeba have been fighting a predator-prey war for millennia, millions and millions of years, and they've learnt, in fact, a large proportion, nearly a third of the genome of Legionella is just to produce what we call effector proteins that only have an effect in a eukaryotic cell, the amoeba, or the same cell, which is the macrophage in our lungs. And this is why we get respiratory disease, because these Legionella have learned to control amoeba and actually kill the amoeba, and they do the same to our macrophages that are normally crawling around our lungs to clean out the bacteria that we are always inhaling during the day. So that's why we end up with this as a problem. So to wrap up all of this, the life cycle assessment tools, I'll just quickly explain those and show you an example. So life cycle assessment is a sort of a cradle-to-cradle concept developed by the Swedes and the Volvo company particularly, but it's gone now global. So there are standard methods for doing this. So it looks at all the raw materials from the mining and production all the way through to the final They call it cradle to cradle because it used to be cradle to grave because they're thinking of it as disposal. But now we don't call it a waste. We don't dispose of it. We reuse it. So it's cradle to cradle. And there are ISO, International Standard Organization, methodologies for dealing with this. So there's an inventory and there's an assessment approach. And with my colleagues at EPA, we've developed, for the sorts of systems you can see on the left here, standard traditional centralized water services. We've developed up an inventory. We've also developed ones for composting toilets, for low flush toilets, for urine diversion toilets. I could spend more time talking about that if you want to hear about it, but why do we have urine diversion toilets? Well, 80% of the nitrogen in the sewer is just in the urine stream, and only less than 1% of the volume of what flows in the sewer is the urine. So why do we dilute our urine with all that other grey water just to spend all that money at the sewage works to try to take that damn nitrogen out again? If we keep it separate, it actually makes it much more easily recoverable and reusable back as a fertilizer. So we did a lot of work with the Swedes on that. Blackwater collection, which is what Pim's company and others have been working with. I'll talk a bit more about that, and grey water. So we actually have an inventory now for all these sorts of what we call unit processes that might be considered by a community. And we have this life cycle assessment tool which the US EPA developed called Tracy. And this is all now, all these different tools are integrated in a open house software called OpenLCA, which my colleagues at EPA have been working with a company in Berlin for a public domain, basically repository where all this information lies, with the ultimate goal is that communities like yours can then ultimately use this to do our life cycle assessments. And so I want to just show how we've done that with the Cape Cod community in Massachusetts. Here's a community that is predominantly on septic systems that is causing massive eutrophication of the coastal communities, both the sort of inlet ponds as well as the coastline. Basically, there aren't any cod left in Cape Cod because of eutrophication. It's a major problem. So business as usual was that they were going to go in there and just sewer the place. And that's what the engineers initially said. And then the communities like Falmouth said, hey, we don't want to spend the $60,000 US per household to connect to a sewer system. We're rejecting that. So along with various other people, we've been advising them on, well, what would be some of the alternatives and how do we assess these alternatives? So we looked at composting toilets with septic systems. We looked at urine diversion with septic systems. We looked at the Blackwater pressure sewer with grey water treatment at the household level and reuse. And we looked at that plus rainwater collection. So these are the 5 configurations we compared. And not to spend a lot of time on the detail, but just look at the bars and the heights of the bars. So in the life cycle assessment, we can look at things like energy use. So this is megajoules per household day. And you can see the business as usual uses the most amount of energy. When we look at the whole system, it includes the fertilizer, the mining of materials, and everything else involved in the whole infrastructure. Our composting toilets are about on par with our Blackwater sewers. But if we then go to the global warming potential, which is our CO2 equivalents produced by methane and CO2 and nitrous oxides that are released through these processes, we can see the business as usual is the worst. Our composting toilets and urine diversion are pretty high as well. There's still a lot of those greenhouse gases going out. But when we recover that methane and burn it and recover the energy, and so we're just releasing the CO2 from that, our greenhouse gas emissions overall is a lot less than the conventional systems. And when we go to looking at health, we see, if you look down the bottom here, we can see that compared to the business as usual, the urine diversion and septic system uses it generates 63% less health burden. We go to composting toilets, it comes down to only a 23% of the business as usual, even better, and without rainfall, another further 1% there. And so this is looking at Legionella and looking at the other enteric pathogens. I'm not presenting the life cycle costing part here, although part of it's been done because it's part of a PhD project still underway, hasn't been submitted for publication, whereas this data has been accepted for publication. So we also have life cycle assessment cost that shows, again, that the energy recovery system is actually the most cost-effective for the system evaluation. And like others, I've worked with the group in Stockholm on Hammarby Högstad. So here's a docklands redevelopment, a bit like Dockside Green, where these sorts of tools have been applied in part. Here's the Hamburg city's development. So here's the city of Hamburg looking at here 680 households with this blackwater energy recovery and rainwater and grey water being treated and going out for wetlands and visual amenity in this community. So these, and again, the costs are there, and you can see here, costing was done by a master's student from when I was at Cincinnati, where she was working at the University of Hamburg in Hamburg on this. And the costing, you can see, is marginally, but is significantly lower using a pressure sewer than a conventional gravity sewer system. So sorry for going for so long. But there's a big picture story here. We need to look at the whole system to make sensible decisions. There are tools now becoming available to help communities with those comparisons, to compare for your community, what do you want to do, what are your aspirations, and how do you look at the system impacts. And we can then, once we've decided on a system, we can then talk about how to best manage that particular system from the point of view of managing the various risks or hazards. And we can actually set performance-based targets, which means, hey, we can go out to a developer or an inventor and say, we're not going to specify that you must use technology X. We're just going to say you need to meet this level of performance, and you tell me how you're going to do that. And this makes it much more flexible for innovation to come into and drive the way we need to move forward here, which is with different system structures and different system components. So the bottom line is, none of this actually works if you only focused on the drinking water or only focused on the wastewater as the water fraction. It only begins to make sense if you look at the embedded energy that comes with those components, and if we think about the resilience to climate change, to increased population pressures because of the urbanization that's occurring. So I will now finish. Sorry for going for so long, and just like to thank some of my colleagues here. And if there is time, I'd love to have questions as well. Thank you.
Just to clarify the exams and take home, you only have until 2 to finish. As Nick has said, he's delighted to take questions, and more than willing to use the rest of the afternoon to carry this discussion on. Our intent was to bring to Colwood, Center of Municipal Innovation since 1985, the notions that Nick and him and others elsewhere in the world are grappling with, to think about the kind of innovation challenges we face in the 21st century, rather than simply adopting the best of what was done in the late 20th century. And so I think I'll leave with that. Take questions, and if you realize that other people may have to leave, so.
Yeah, I won't feel we have to race out the door. Please do so, or whenever. Yeah.
I'm curious, you talked about happening after the water treatment plant. What's the mechanism?
Great question. So this is a critical question. Excuse me. Hospitals and larger buildings. And when we go into those plumbing and look where the organism is actually growing, one way to manage that is to maintain the temperature above 55 degrees. But that's the hot water production heating needs to be about 60 degrees. And what they do in hospitals these days now is they actually have those recirculating loop. If you maintain that circulating loop above 55 degrees, there is no way that, I was talking through that one. There is no way that Legionella can replicate. It actually doesn't really grow much above, we think about 42 to 45 degrees centigrade. And so temperature is one. Then you're left with the cold water. And so you need to be careful not to have stagnant cold water as well as the hot water, and particularly not having your cold water too close to your hot water systems, so the cold water heats up. I don't know if you turn on I've actually noticed this quite a bit since I've moved to Alberta. When you first turn on the tap in a house, it's quite warm, and then you wait half a minute and you're getting the true water from the water main, and it's much colder. So there's that stagnation period where water is warming up. And these are organisms that grow in the biofilms, the slimes on the walls of surfaces. So they're not totally getting flushed out every time you flush that cold water through. They're just getting chilled. It's like putting them in the fridge, so they stop growing, and then when the water warms up again, they start growing again. So there have been cases of dentists giving themselves and their patients Legionnaire's disease because of the plastic tubing in dentistries. When you're getting yourself drilled and you're getting that spray into your mouth, and this is why dentists these days wear face masks, is to stop themselves getting Legionnaire's disease from those aspirants or particles of aerosols coming from basically the warm water from the plumbing in those situations. So reducing what we call dead ends, flushing water, not having a water reservoir on the roof of your house, which used to be common practice to save energy. And here's the second thing. We often turn down the thermostat in our hot water cylinders to save energy. But if you have an electrically heated as opposed to gas-heated hot water, think about that. There are electrodes on the side of a hot water cylinder for electricity heated water. And water's coming in cold, it's heavier, so it goes to the bottom. So the water down the bottom, even if your thermostat is set for, say, 55 degrees coming out, or even 60, the temperature of the bottom can be as cold as 40 to 45 degrees centigrade because of stratification. And so, but if you've got a gas heater at the bottom, then that circulates the water. So we see much less stratification occurring in gas-heated hot water than we do with the electric element-heated ones. So it might be a good idea to get rid of your electric-heated ones as another part of the management, or you have to beef up the temperature even higher, which means using more energy.
So how do you fight that?
Yeah. You never can is the quick answer. But you can manage them. Oh, yeah. Peroxide, and if you were to physically brush it out, that would be great. But think about the microbes. There's a saying here, the microbe always wins. So it's always about the conditions. So you want to put the conditions that are least favorable for Legionella and most favorable for the guys that will take up that ecological space. So we're now working on, well, what are the good guys in there that will grow and colonize and actually elbow out the Legionella? And if you think about, well, where's Legionella growing? It's growing in those amoeba. So what are the conditions that either reduce the total number of amoeba or certain types of amoeba is where my current research is focused to try to help answer that question for you. But at the moment, all we can say is temperature management, chlorine residual in that hot and cold water is important. At least it will kill off the cells when they get released from the biofilm. It doesn't kill them inside the biofilm very well at all. That's why you can never get rid of them. And in Sweden, in hospitals, they actually heat the whole plumbing to 80 degrees for 10 minutes. And we've shown that even that doesn't totally eliminate. Some of the Legionella get encysted in the cysts of the amoeba and are protected from that thermal shock to some degree. So when the water cools down again, they grow back out and they'll recolonize. So this practice of either high temperature heating and or flushing needs to be done on a regular basis just to maintain the levels low enough not to lead to those high numbers that we estimate are necessary to cause Legionnaire's disease. So not a very satisfying answer, was it? Sorry, and rather long. My apologies. Was there a question over here? Yeah. Okay. Hopefully not the sewer, from the drinking point of view. Yeah. Okay, well, that's a good point. So think about biofilms. They need organic carbon. And so if you're not removing that or you're using a fairly rich organic carbon source, so this is why the Dutch do pretty well. They spend a lot of effort in bank infiltration and then going on with ozone or filtration and ozonation to get their amount of dissolved organic matter as low as possible. So one, there's very little biofilm growth in their pipes relative to what happens in North America because there's just not enough organic carbon for supporting that growth.
Cleaning the water, like my concern is that you over-clean the water where...
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I'm working on another theory here that our chlorine residual, a bit like our antibiotics, is actually upsetting our microbiome. No, I would not use chlorine, but if...
So what I do is I use physical, like I've got 3 trays of filters,
Yeah.
then the garden water goes off. And then in the house we have
Yeah.
ceramic filters,
Yeah.
followed by UV, followed by,
Yeah, that's good.
and then an RO before we actually drink. So,
Yeah, so from a contaminant point of view, that's bulletproof to the RO, then it's post-RO. So you want to have that RO as close to the point of use as possible. So that's why the best place is usually under the kitchen sink where you're getting your glasses of water or using it, or in the bathroom area where you might be, washing your teeth is a relatively lower level risk here. The shower is the other big one. So hospitals, they actually put a point of use device in some hospitals to filter at the shower head or to UV at the shower head. In fact, I'm working with a company just in northern Kentucky using light-emitting diode for UV treatment, which is actually being incorporated into facilities like shower heads or faucets. So it actually UV the water just as the point of use.
I have a centralized RO, and that's because we needed a pressure volume in order to actually flow.
Yeah.
Equipped with the RO water. So the problem is the normal RO, they trickle out of the little
Well, another problem with RO, do you have copper or plastic pipe in this house?
process polyethylene.
Okay, that's good. Because if you had copper, you can actually have copper solvency issues and getting pitting and all sorts of other things. Good. Okay. Well, in case there are others who wish to ask a question, I'll just see, and we can come back and talk more later. Yeah. Yeah, so.
It seems to me that, well, all of this is actually kind of satisfying from a scientific and technological point of view, if you can see the issues and potential solutions to those issues. But the big obstacle I see here is economics. How this gets distributed and who pays for it.
Yeah, no,
And if you can't pay for it,
it's not going to happen.
because, well, Detroit is an example of that.
Well, most of the Rust Belt, where I was in Cincinnati and Cleveland, even Chicago, are near bankrupt because huge costs sunk in their current water and wastewater services. They cannot maintain them, and that's why they're basically collapsing under their feet at the moment. And Detroit is just a classic case because, there are no longer 2 million people there. There's, 650,000. And there's just not enough people to support that infrastructure's maintenance. So we know our current systems are really expensive to maintain. So you hit on a really important point. And one I try to emphasize here is that all of these alternatives need to be framed around resource recovery, because when you factor in the value in dollar terms of that resource, it's almost a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you do this? And so, yeah. And so this can be then driven by the developers and others because they're going to want to do this because it actually makes economic sense. So then you look at the other hurdle, which perhaps you're alluding to as well, which is the regulatory world that we live within. At the moment, the regulatory world actually doesn't allow